You're listening to Let's Talk AI.
Good day. I'm Harold Godwin, Managing Director of Waterloo AI. I'll be your host. Today's guest is Matthew Silk. Matthew is a lecturer in the Faculty of Arts, Department of Philosophy. His focus is on the ethics of AI. Matthew is also a chair of the Ethics AI Society here at Waterloo. So, welcome, Matthew.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you here today. So, So, Matthew, first of all, before we jump into the ethics of AI, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you get into this role as a lecturer here at UW? And we'll go from there.
Sure. So I came to university originally for poli-sci at Laurier, and then eventually decided to get into philosophy. And then shortly after, once I finished my undergrad, I did my master's at Laurier as well, again in philosophy. And then I went to UW for my PhD, where I studied mostly, I tended to specialize in things like philosophy of science and the values in science debate. And then once that started, or once I completed that, I started teaching, and then eventually I started to get into things like the ethics of AI, which in many ways is just kind of an extension of a lot of topics in philosophy of science. So.
Okay, well, so let's get right into the heart of this here. Now, what is the scope? What does that mean? The ethics of AI. Where do you even start to that topic?
It's very tricky because it's such a huge scope to it. Just because there are so many different ways in which AI is and will be interacting with humanity. So there's just a very large scope of topics with it that fall within the topic. Everything from concern about bias in AI to the way people are interacting with potentially, AI models of deceased family members to generative AI and the whole question of, can generative AI count as art and who gets to take credit for that kind of thing. Even issues relating to machine learning and opacity, and is there a serious risk? Are there ethical concerns that are raised by the idea that you might be deferring to an algorithm that you may not fully understand? So it's a pretty big topic, and a lot of it, even still fits within the sort of topic of the relationship between science and society and democracy and science and all these other things. So there's a pretty large scope to all the issues that can fall under the category of ethics of AI.
Okay, so when you mentioned one term, you said machine learning and opacity. What's that all about? Expand on that further, please.
So, with certain forms of machine learning, essentially the process that creates the model allows, obviously, the developer to create a model where they'll understand the inputs and the outputs of the model, but they may not necessarily know how the model works or how it's taking inputs and converting that into outputs. And that can be tricky for a lot of different reasons, particularly with the possibility that something could go wrong. So, for example, one of the issues that I've studied with and have researched quite a bit is the issue of what's called inductive risk, which basically asks this question of what are the risks of getting something wrong? And would the risk of getting it wrong make you demand a different standard of evidence for the kind of claim that you might make? Now, in the face of opacity with AI, it makes it very difficult to manage those inductive risks, to say that maybe I should have a higher standard of evidence for a particular kind of claim I might make, whether it's, maybe it's something like a cancer diagnosis, a medical algorithm that's designed to detect cancer, right? What are the ethical risks of getting it wrong, especially if I may not fully understand how that model works and what it might specifically be looking for and what specifically led it to that kind of conclusion. So can the developer, can the medical expert or the doctor or the physician gauge the amount of evidence that they should have for that claim, given that they don't fully understand the model?
So is opacity, hand in hand with the term explainability, or are they different?
It can be. So the interesting thing, so opacity just obviously means, it just means the idea that you may not fully understand what the algorithm's doing. But the interesting thing is that when we're talking about AI, and again, all of the different potential uses of AI that can be used, there are different stakeholders involved, and the kind of explanation that they might want from a model may vary, right? So if for example, if regulators are concerned that an algorithm might be biased or might be hiding a bias, then the kinds of explanations that they might want might be very different from somebody who got a test, a medical test, and may ask their doctor, like, why does this mean this, or how do you know that I have a certain kind of illness or ailment or something like that. So the issue of explainability can vary based on who is interested and what kind of explanation they might want.
Okay. Okay. Now you talked about bias earlier, and backing up a little bit, bias, as I understand, comes from two parts. One could be from the data, one could be from the model. So are there ethics on both of those that you could expand further on?
Sure, yeah. So the interesting thing is that I've done a fair amount of research tackling sort of both sides of that question, right? So on the one hand, you can intentionally or not build biases into a model based off of the kind of assumptions that you make about the model before you've put it together, right? So if a model is just an input and an output, there's input data and then there's a process and then it comes up as an output. What assumptions make sense to you that would say that given these certain kinds of inputs, a certain kind of output makes sense? So a really good example of this is the issue of recidivism, right? So if you make a recidivism algorithm that's designed to determine whether someone is likely to be a recidivist in the future, that's going to involve a lot of assumptions about what recidivism is and what kind of marks and features are likely to indicate a recidivist. And that involves a lot of assumptions.
So what does that term mean?
Recidivism?
Yes.
The likelihood to recommit a criminal offense.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. So the question is, like, again, if legal, if courts and stuff are using algorithms like this to determine if someone should be likely to get parole, or based off of the kind of sentence that they're supposed to receive, again, what kind of assumptions lie behind what you think a recidivist might be, and what marks and metrics would you look for to determine if someone is likely to be a recidivist, and how might those assumptions be biased?
So again, back to intentional versus unintentional. When they start to build these models, I can't imagine someone purposefully decided, oh, I'm going to leave out a certain ethnic group or include and things like that. That may have been what it appears after the fact. But as humanity, we mostly learn when we've made a mistake or failed, and then we fix it and keep improving and getting better. And I said, moving forward with an AI team approach where it was like, oh, wow, okay, now we'll change that. How much of this bias is like as a percentage is coming from data versus the model? Could you say something off the top of your head?
I don't think I could say off the top of my head, because to some extent it involves an interplay between the two, right? So for example, based on the kind of assumptions that you might have before you've even created the model, that might determine the kinds of data sets that you think are relevant to that issue, or to those assumptions, right? And so one assumption might lead you to picking a data set that might include a lot of biases in it, right? And so part of it can be caused by the limitations of data. Some of it might be caused by the fact that sometimes there isn't always massive amounts of data that is often needed to train these algorithms, and so you kind of look to whatever data you can, even if that might include biases. So that can happen. But there can also be problems where you might intentionally or unintentionally pick a biased data set because of biased assumptions you have about what you're trying to measure in the first place.
So early, building on this further, then early in late 22 and 23, there were large policies introduced from Europe, Canada, US. In those policies, and I'm sure you've had a look through them, where does ethics fit in there? Or is that kind of an underlying theme in behind them all?
So part of so I mean I would broadly include ethics, or I would say that a lot of political issues also fall within the scope of ethics, in the sense that regulators, governments, oftentimes they're simply trying to address what they perceive as ethical problems, right, that deserve a kind of regulation. So yeah, the thing with a lot with ethics, again, a lot of these issues are issues that might come up even from the perspective of users, right? So they might be going to their governments and asking, like, why do these algorithms work the way they do? And of course, the other thing too is a lot of issues that will tie into matters of at least in terms of broad public importance, things like privacy. So these might be issues that affect people on a day-to-day basis that they perceive as an ethical problem, and then we might call for a kind of public or regulatory response to sort of resolve that kind of problem.
So this is like an ever evolving, growing field. So as more new AI comes out, is there any latest hot topic on ethics you want to expand on?
There's a lot of really interesting topics that I think are coming out. So for example, one of the concerns is, this is just one small one, is the relationship between, again, people who are um, algorithms and things that can be developed to mimic or approximate deceased ones, right? And should people, what kind of relationship and what might be a healthy relationship between a living person who's grieving and the kind of relationship that they might try to sort of establish with an AI? Does it create potential for the person not being able to grieve properly, or developing sort of unhealthy habits towards the AI, or anthropomorphizing the AI and thinking that it is more than it is? So that can be obviously a big problem. So I think, and I think even larger, like that's just that larger question of how will sort of average everyday humans interact with AI? Like, how will they, relate to each other? And what kind of habits might follow from that? So that's one small issue that's kind of, I think, emerging and will continue to emerge.
Oh, I've never even heard of that one. That sounds like a whole new segment of business opportunity, or again. But is it helping or hurting?
That's the other thing too, is there's a lot of the commercialism. AI is not cheap to make, right? And so again, is it exploitative, for example, for a company to say, well, you can continue to talk to your dead mother, but only if you pay the subscription?
Wow, that's yeah, that can really be a problem because obviously everyone wants to still talk to them.
Well, and how close are they, you know, to this person, right? What is the appropriate relationship that someone might have? I mean, I wouldn't prejudge it and say that it would be completely unhealthy, but I do think that it's one of those things that we might need to sort of sort out a little bit, because there is just so much room for exploitation and people, just kind of going a bit too far with things.
It's almost like the immortality business. Okay, so going back to something you mentioned earlier, Gen AI in art, and I'm going to put in there creativity and who owns what. Expand further on that one, please.
So this is actually a topic I'm trying to address a little bit more right now, because it's I've had so many people ask about this question, right? Because you have generative AI that can that can produce obviously written material, it can produce audio material, it can produce video and visual material as well. And there you have people who have, for example, entered art contests and won first prize, right? And so this raises that question of, well, is this person truly the artist? Who is the artist in this case? And is it appropriate to use an algorithm that essentially incorporates other artists' imagery into it and uses that to generate an image, right? So there's this question of who owns the art, who is the artist, and is this really art at all? And so that's, those are a lot of big issues that are coming up, and even obviously when in terms of even in things like the movie industry and stuff like that, there's this question of using art, like building models based off of artists' likeness, whether it's a voice or audio, and how appropriate is it to use those kinds of things. Again, going back to the question of deceased actors, is it appropriate to use a deceased person's image and likeness in a film in ways that they may not have approved of, right? So there's the question of the currently existing artists and how do they sort of try to accommodate, or how do they respond to the issue of AI? And then there's the people who are now using that AI and the ethical consequences that can follow from that. In some cases, I actually think it's pretty good. Like, I've been able to use a lot of generated images in my classes, and in some ways to help visualize concepts that might be difficult for students to grasp otherwise. So, there are positives and negatives to it, but it's certainly a complicated issue to sort out, right? I'm more of the view that I think these things are, generative AI algorithms are more of a kind of tool for an artist, right? Even the people who tend to use these things to make art, they don't. The issue is not just that they're typing in a prompt and saying I'm done. No, there's a lot of selection, there's a lot of variation, there's a lot of choice, there's a lot of a desire to express a certain kind of idea or concept through the algorithm. And so I'm much more of the view that these things are more tools for an artist potentially.
The famous quote we've all heard, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So if art is about creating the beauty, is it really a subjective thing? I mean, we're all going to decide what is art, what is not art. And that's where then how does somebody else have the right to say it doesn't matter, you used a gen AI tool, therefore it's not art. But if someone thinks it's awesome, like, who's saying, who gets to be the judge?
Well, yeah, I mean it's tricky, and then especially if you compare it to a lot of other art forms, right? I mean, a lot of other art forms, you're still using tools to produce the object. If you're a photographer, for instance, you're not generating those images yourself per se, but there's still a lot of choice and selection that has to go into the final piece, right? Does the color look appropriate? Does it, do the colors fit together? Does it express the idea appropriately? All these things, and the AI itself can't make those decisions for you. Ultimately, it's the person who's using the image who has to make those decisions. But I do think the question of creativity is an interesting one too, because a lot of these algorithms are based off of kind of a statistical mesh of other art forms, then there's this question of does it create room for a kind of creativity to come out through through the model, like through as a kind of blending of other art forms, right? Can you actually use it to produce something new? So that's an interesting question as well.
Some people say, well, it's going to dampen pure creativity. Well, I'm not sure any of us could even define what that is, because even an artist is going to be influenced by another artist. He may not have a gen AI tool or what, etc. But there's going to be some influence somewhere. I mean, even in the patent system, you have to quote the prior art. What came before, to assess whether there was a creative leap, an invention, novelty. And there's hard rules in the patent system. So I'm wondering if some of these ideas get transferred over to the art world, and use that as there's got to be three or four, because I think in the patents, from what I remember, there has to be at least three or four new novel, never been done in that area. And then that starts to mesh together to create a measure of novelty. Maybe there's similar things like that in the art space.
Well, a lot of art doesn't just sort of come from nowhere. Oftentimes, it is influenced by previous artists, right? And that's, but again, one of the interesting things about the creativity of the algorithm itself is that it might be able to mesh together things from the sort of art world in a way that maybe might not have occurred to a human or would be new, but it still takes the human to recognize the creativity, to recognize the novelty of it, right? Because an algorithm could produce all kinds of things that we might have never seen before, but we may not necessarily consider them all to be creative, right? And so there's still a kind of sense in which it's us that's recognizing the creativity, it's us that's recognizing the novelty, and we might latch on to that.
Admittedly, I'm more aligned with your perspective that these are tools to enhance our performance or growth, creativity.
I've been trying to do this a lot with my students as well, like in terms of integrating the use of AI into the classroom, because I'm trying to get my students to recognize that you can't, hopefully not use the something like ChatGPT to just produce your paper, but you can use ChatGPT to give you feedback on a paper. You can use it to help you inspire certain kinds of ideas, right? If you know to ask the right questions, it might be able to produce something that might actually be very helpful to you to help you along the process of revision and writing and things like that. So you can use it as a tool to help your writing.
Well, you do bring up a great topic as a lecturer and students submitting papers. Have you found yourself in an ethical position of clearly feeling this paper was written by a generative as opposed to the student? And how do you handle that?
I found there have been some cases where there are certain papers on a topic that seem to read very similarly in a way that doesn't necessarily lead me to think that they're colluding. It's more just like like the beats are all the same. You know what I mean? Like throughout the paper. Um, the big thing is when it comes to, I mean, part of again is I get why undergraduate students might be tempted to use the algorithm. I think the big thing is trying to teach the student that it's ultimately better for them in the long run to focus on their own development, right? Use it to help yourself develop rather than just using it as a means out of something, right? I will say the other thing too is I feel like I've definitely read emails from students that were written by ChatGPT.
Exactly. So you mentioned initially, well, you know what, I've seen them. I've got the when our interns apply for their jobs and I ask them to write a bold cover letter, they take the job description and dump it into ChatGPT, put their name and say, there you go, and it's like probably one of the most creative that I did reject though is someone wrote on one page in the statement at the top said cover letter and they bolded it. And they said, there you go, bold cover letter. And probably got 10 out of 10 for creativity, but one out of 10 for effort. So, you know,
Yeah, it's obviously, like I said, it's very tempting to want to use something like ChatGPT because it can make things so easy. But you can use it to help you sort of develop your actual writing skills itself, right? And so, for example, one of the things that I've tried to do is focus less on the idea of the final project or the final paper as the product and more focus on the process of writing itself, right? So in the classroom, I've had students present their ideas, get feedback, talk about how they want to change their paper, that kind of stuff, and even talk about like, oh, the algorithm told me to do this or the algorithm suggested that, and based on that, I can make tweaks. But the thing that concerns me about some of the use of generative AI in this way too is that you mentioned cover letters. A lot of hiring now is done by algorithm, right? So you now have algorithms that are looking for keywords and you have people using algorithms to make, so it's like job applications written by AI to be read by AI, and they're all more or less trying to do the same thing, which is just to try to figure out what marks or metrics are likely to boost their score, right? So it ends up kind of being it can my concern is that this slowly descends into a kind of weird farce where hiring and applications and all that kind of stuff are kind of meaningless because nobody's actually involved
I
in
don't think
most of it.
we have enough time to cover that topic today, but that's very interesting. So, congrats, Matthew. You're working on a book soon to be published. What's the target on that one?
It's supposed to be out this year, I think. We're just right on the final proof edit stages, so hopefully it should be coming out this year. It's called An Inquirer's Guide to Ethics and AI. So, and yeah, it covers a lot of the topics that we were talking about.
Okay, and well, that almost then would jive with the fact that you're having a 2-day symposium in November. So maybe you get it done beforehand and do a little book signings at the event or something.
Well, that's the hope. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm that shameless of a promoter, but yes, but yeah, hopefully it will come out. And I mean, I've had so many people who have um, you know expressed an interest in reading it and wanting it because I do think it is a topic that is just becoming very much part of the public consciousness. I mean, every day you can pretty much find some new story about this kind of stuff. So yeah, hopefully it'll be out before the symposium.
So talk to us about the symposium. Who's it for, and who can come? And
Sure, yeah. So this will be actually the second symposium we've done this year. We did one back in March, and now we're hoping to do a second one that will be 2 days long. So it'll take place on November 21st and 22nd, and uh, basically we're focusing on sort of four broad themes. So we have generative AI and ethics. We have biased AI, um, social trust. And society and AI, and then we're also going to have focus on machine learning and large language models as well. And yeah, that'll take place in November, and we have already lined up Maura Grossman as our keynote speaker. So we're all very excited about that.
well, make sure you loop back with us, and we'll promote it through our Waterloo AI newsletter and our website.
Oh, and that's the other thing. Sorry, that was the other thing too. Is it's the symposium is basically for everybody. The ethics of AI society. One of the things that we try to do is make sure that we're open to everybody, and that anybody who wants to learn about either AI or about ethics can show up and ask questions and learn a little bit. So it's open to everybody.
And that's on and off campus when you say anybody,
Yeah, presumably, yeah. I mean, anyone who has an interest,
like
yeah.
students, community, local
Yeah.
ecosystem, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to reach out to various other like outside organizations as well. So hopefully we'll be able to drum up some interest.
Okay, well, Matthew, thank you for being a guest today on Let's Talk AI. This has been very
Yeah, thanks for
insightful,
having me.
and congratulations on your book. And we look forward to your symposium in November.
Yeah, thanks. And again, it was great talking to you. I really enjoyed this.
Excellent. Well, take care.
Alrighty, take care.